Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me as I talk through the Excellence in Assessment designation that is, as you can see, co-sponsored by the three institutions or organizations listed below: the National Institute for Learning Outcomes Assessment, BSA Analytics, and the Association of American Colleges and Universities, otherwise known as AAC&U. I am Janina Baker. I am the Assistant Director at NILOA, and I'm joined by Tammy Eggleston of MCKENDRE University and Melanie Wazinski of Florida A&M University, who will let us in on their assessment process at their respective universities. This obviously is a recording that we'll post to our website where you can learn more about EIA on your own time. A few things that we'll talk through today includes what is the EIA designation, how do you apply, what does the application actually entail, and then what's the review process. So let's get started. Here at NILOA, we recognize that doing good integrated assessment is only half the job. We need to be better at communicating what we're doing, how we're supporting it on our campuses, and what it all means to our stakeholders. Even those campuses that are engaged in intentionally aligned assessment of student learning struggle to tell those stories to the variety of stakeholders that they are accountable to. While most institutions now make a practice of publicly stating what their learning outcomes are, they generally share assessment findings internally, and frequently only to faculty or assessment committees. Rarely are assessment plans or rationales shared, even with students or alums, much less with external stakeholders, such as employers, and institutions who accept students for continued study, state legislators, or the public. Put another way, institutions talk about assessment to themselves when and if they talk about it at all. In keeping with the original vision of the VSA to help institutions better tell their stories, the EIA designation uses a rubric that was developed by NILOA. It's from the transparency framework to evaluate campus applications, creating an intentional focus on communication of assessment processes and results, of which we will discuss later. Before we go much further, though, I want to let you know that all the information that we'll talk about today can be found on our website here. Not only will you find the application packet, rubric, and important deadlines, you will also find information on past designees, who are our reviewers, and additional resources on the EIA designation, such as a checklist to make sure everything is finished. At the 2019 AAC&U annual meeting, Dr. Jillian Kinsey, an NILOA senior scholar and also works at IU Bloomington, put forward this continuum for institutions to think how they are currently communicating assessment of student learning to its audiences. As we talk through this, I invite you to think about where your own institution falls, and then begin thinking about how strategies such as the EIA designation can help your institution move to the right. The first stage is very much one of compliance, where you post outcomes and select results, most likely that are favorable to your institution. The next stage, where institutions overshare and just flood their institution with data that's easy to measure, data that's easy to show that they're doing something, right? When we get to this next phase, what comes next is a much more measured or tailored approach, where institutions begin to think about audience and purpose and where to communicate such information. Following next is where institutions begin to really take stock of what's happening on their campus, where learning is taking place, and thinking about the different audiences that are being served and how to communicate that. And what you see in this last part of the continuum is where institutions are really able to tell a nuanced story, right? In using a tailored framework that helps them communicate their outcomes, their improvements, in a comprehensive, student-focused, culturally responsive way. Overall, what you see from left to the right is the shift of an institution just needing something to communicate to that of an institution that uses frameworks to help guide its communication process. We, the three sponsoring organizations, believe that the EIA designation assists with this. That is, developing a cohesive narrative that assists institutions in communicating what's happening around student learning. So what does the application consist of? As you can see, these are some of the main components on your screen. It's important to note here that it is an electronic application. The email address is located in the application packet that you'll send all your materials to. So If you submit your application and don't receive confirmation, don't hesitate to contact us. We want to make sure you get that confirmation email. The first 3 bullets specifically make up the application itself. So a letter from senior leadership, either your president, your chancellor, your provost, states why the institution decided to actually pursue the EIA designation. The letter is the introduction to your institution's application and should be no more than 2 pages. The letter should provide an overview of your institution's submission for the EIA designation, including any highlights you wish to emphasize in your application. It is important to note here, though, that this letter is not scored as part of the application, but is definitely an integral part. For the completed institutional context form, it's not scored, but it's needed should you receive the designation, as this provides us with information on key contacts to communicate the decision, as well as your communications or marketing contact within the institution. And then the 3rd bullet point, an annotated list of individuals and groups engaged in assessment activities across the institution. This can include assessment councils or committees at the college, program, department, and or unit level, with brief descriptions of the charge of each group as it relates to assessment. These individuals and groups are not required to participate in the creation of the application, but rather are intended to help reviewers better understand the structure of assessment processes, and this is a good point, should be no more than 2 pages. This brief overview can also serve as a reference document within the narrative so that you don't have to continue to explain the function of each group, and you can just point and go back to this as an appendix in some ways. If so desired, we definitely encourage the use of an appendix to annotate the list of individuals and groups. And then the 4th bullet point, application narrative. Between 2,000 and no more than 3,000 words is what's included here. Tables and figures that are included in the process narrative do count toward the 3,000 word limit. However, it does not include what you just saw ahead of in the first 3 bullet points, the letter from senior leadership, institutional context form, or that annotated list. The narrative, though, should be written to an audience of higher education peers who are not familiar with your institution's context or assessment process or approach. For this reason, we ask institutions to include an introduction to the context, philosophy, and or history behind the assessment approach outlined within the narrative. Basic familiarity with higher education assessment, accreditation, and accountability concepts can be assumed. And we hope that you, in this application, address each of the 8 domains that's laid out, and we'll talk briefly here in this webinar, as viewed from the perspective of your institution, from an institution-wide assessment process of student learning outcomes. I think it's important to note here that as you think about your narrative and as we go through the transparency framework itself, that not each of those domains that we talked about, those 8 domains, they don't need to be given equal space. You decide the best use and formatting of your information. You can include links to additional information online and provide appendices as references within your narrative if you feel that the information cannot be actually contained within or succinctly summarized or described within a narrative. Reviewers will be asked to read materials at web links or appendices only as noted in the application narrative components. However, reviewers are required to visit no more than 3 links in any section. We encourage applicants make every attempt to include all pertinent information in their narrative, not to attach forms, templates, reports, or screenshots, in lieu of describing the process for and functions of integrated assessment activities at your institution. The narrative elements of the EIA places an emphasis on why particular processes are utilized, as well as the action that results from it. And we hope that the narrative helps you clearly and succinctly explain why you do what you do when it comes to institution-wide assessment of student learning. There's 2 award levels, Sustained Excellence and Excellence. The distinction between the 2 is that those who are given the Sustained Excellence designation have been and clearly can trace back that this work has been ongoing for 5 years or more at their institution. It is a national recognition process, and it's open to any accredited degree granting institution. Again, here, it's important to note that it's not just at a particular college level. It is institution-wide. And then this last bullet point is that it's, again, institution level assessment. So we're hopefully you're able to, in the narrative, talk through this vertical integration, right, that builds from classroom engagement and goes up, and horizontal, where there's this intentional inclusion of student affairs and external stakeholders, alums, whatever that looks like on your campus. That there's not just this emphasis only on the academic side, but that there's definitely been this horizontal inclusion as you think about institution level assessment. I think this is a great graphical representation of what we just highlighted, right? Ideally, scaffolding of learning outcomes occurs across courses, programs, and co-curricular experiences, such that the assessment work from an individual course or learning experience can link to and inform the assessment work of a program. This scaffolding allows for fewer assessment activities to occur at higher levels of the pyramid than at lower levels. The evidence that's built from beneath serves to support the evidence provided at the top. And this explains in part why a single representative sample of institution level assessment outcomes is only one way to reliably represent the learning of all students. So keep that in mind as you're thinking about writing it up. I've cited the NILOA transparency framework, and I want to come back in case you're not familiar with it. NILOA created the transparency framework to help institutions evaluate the extent to which they are making evidence of student accomplishment readily accessible and potentially useful and meaningful to various audiences. We created it to hopefully help institutions just really think about, as if I were trying to provide some useful and meaningful information, what does that look like? Some of our graduate research analysts at the time reviewed over 2,000 institutional assessment websites. And from that resulted this transparency framework, which consists of 6 components centered around a set of underlying principles that are common to all of the components. We hope that you use the framework to examine your own institutional websites to gauge the extent to which evidence of student accomplishment is readily accessible and potentially useful and meaningful to the intended audience. To help better understand the connection between the framework and the designation, I'll go through each of them briefly. Let's start at the central tenets of it. And you can see in the middle of the framework, we often put these tenets, right? That there's, again, after looking at all the websites and then thinking about website transparency, we want to ensure that hopefully common to all that it's clear, right? It's clearly worded. There's no jargon used, that it's easy to find, and that it's relevant and timely, hopefully, and that includes an updated regularly component of that. In terms of student learning outcome statements, what are reviewers looking for here? And I provided the guiding questions that are located in the packet itself. So don't worry, you don't have to write down all of these questions, just go there and look for it. What are reviewers looking for here? When we think about the student learning outcome statements, just in general, they clearly state the expected knowledge, skills, attitudes, competencies, and or habits of mind that students are expected to acquire at an institution. So for the purposes of the EIA designation, reviewers are looking for evidence that student learning outcome statements are integrated with co-curricular, college, program, unit, and course levels. For assessment plans, I'm sure you're asking, what are the reviewers looking for here? Glad you asked. Institution level assessment plans for gathering evidence of student learning might include institution-wide approaches that convey how student learning will be assessed, the data collection tools and approaches that will be used, and the timeline for implementation. Such plans may build on the work from program level and unit level plans, but should represent some level of common assessment activities designed to provide evidence of the learning throughout the institution. For the purposes of the EIA designation, reviewers are looking for evidence that the assessment plans across the institution are intentionally integrated or scaffolded, especially between and among academic and student affairs. We hope, again, here, by providing these guiding questions, you don't have to answer every single question in the narrative, but we really wanted to just help you think as you write through your narratives to capture evidence in each of the domain areas, because that's exactly what reviewers are looking for evidence of and will use when they're scoring your application with the associated rubric. So we hope that these just help guide some of your writing and your thoughts around each of these core components, again, of the transparency framework. Here with assessment resources, it encompasses information or training that's provided to faculty, students, and staff to help them understand, develop, implement, communicate, and use evidence of student learning. Here, reviewers are looking for evidence of a centralized location where faculty and staff locate resources on assessment best practices, including information on institution level assessment activities and how they're integrated with program, unit, and course information. In addition, they're also looking for evidence of policy and procedures for evaluating faculty and staff, including informal or official supports and or recognition of efforts that are made to improve or advance assessment practices, either individually, within a program, or at the institution level. Current assessment activities include information on the full range of projects and activities that are recently completed or currently underway to gauge institution level student learning, make improvements, or even respond to accountability interests. In this component, reviewers are looking to see that information on current assessment activities is easily accessible to various audiences, both on and off campus, including information on how institution level assessment activities integrate with program, unit, and course assessment. Evidence of student learning, one of my favorites. Here, this includes results of institution level assessment activities. This may include evidence of indirect, like surveys, or direct, like a portfolio, student learning, as well as institutional performance metrics like licensure pass rates. Reviewers here are looking for evidence of how the institution connects the dots between the multiple layers of assessment activities occurring within programs, units, courses, and various learning experiences to provide an integrated picture of student learning. And this last component, one of the hardest. The sixth component represents the extent to which institution level evidence of student learning is used. Clear distinction here, is used to identify areas where changes in policies and practices may lead to improvement, inform institutional decision-making, problem identification, planning, goal setting, faculty development, course revision, program review, and accountability or accreditation self-study. Reviewers are looking for evidence from multiple levels to guide programmatic and curricular decision-making, as well as monitor and evaluate the results of those decisions for improvements in learning. Not only is this one of the hardest categories to provide evidence of, it definitely is, it provides the reviewers a space to really reflect on, does this institution really deserve the excellence in assessment designation? Is there evidence of this occurring on their campus? In each of those components that I just talked through, each of those six, we want you to make sure that you not only clearly label those in your application, but really write your narrative around your assessment process to those that are not familiar with you. While the guiding questions are strongly linked with the scoring rubric and assisting institutions and assess it, we hope that it assists institutions in assessing the breadth and depth of your assessment activities in your response. You're not required, again, to explicitly respond and separately to each and every single question. Definitely use the rubric to help guide your conversations and your narrative. And this last piece, reflection and growth, that we ask you to think about. Even institutions that excel at using assessment results to inform and guide their decision-making still have room for improvement. And in this final narrative component of the EIA application, reviewers look forward to really reading revelations made by your application team in the process of completing your application, reflecting on the overall quality and robustness of your institutional assessment system and use of assessment data, and the identification of concrete steps you plan to take in the next 3 years to grow or improve your institutional use or integration of institutional assessment results. This truly is one of the fun spaces to read, to see how institutions are pushing forward. So the 2016 guidelines included an expectation for a large and diverse campus application team to engage in the self-study process that we feel was best to aid campuses in preparing the EIA designation application narrative. Unfortunately, we place too much emphasis on representation within an application team without addressing our true intent, that a broad and diverse group of campus committees and individual leads individuals are actively and substantively engaged in ongoing assessment activities. The application guidelines have been altered to make it clear that while an ideal institutional assessment plan will be inclusive of a broad and diverse set of constituents, it is not a requirement that all of those parties engage directly in creating the campus application narrative. However, we would encourage a team charged with crafting the campus application narrative to be inclusive of various audiences in some substantive way. This expectation is an intentional effort to address a barrier to integrated approaches to assessment that only one office or a few individuals are in charge of and responsible for supporting the entire campus enterprise. The majority of our 2016 EIA applicants revealed in their narrative that they struggled to engage various groups in their campus level assessment processes in a consistent and connected manner. For instance, either student affairs were not involved in an assessment at a campus level, or they had a separate approach not connected with the academic side of the house that was made clear in the application process. Further, few campuses reported actively engaging adjuncts or part-time faculty, students, alums, receiving institutions, and employers in their assessment work. These areas were subsequently identified in the reflection and growth and improvement plans, with many applicants stating intentions to make better connections with these groups moving forward. Using the application process as a means to think collectively as a campus about strategies to better address areas of disconnect proved to be a strong use of the EIA application self-study process. As you look at that second bullet point, a panel of experts, assessment experts specifically from around the country, review and score each institutional application. At least two, many times there are three, I think most times there are three reviewers that actually read each submission. Reviewers then use the scoring rubric that's available on the website that you can also look at to evaluate submissions. The rubric scoring is based off of evidence provided in the institutional application and narrative. Applications are reviewed holistically prior to scoring by expert reviewers. The minimum score for consideration of even being awarded the designation is 72. However, meeting the minimum overall score does not guarantee receipt of a designation. Reviewer recommendations are taken into consideration, and the final decision is made in consultation with the reviewers and staff of the sponsoring groups and associations. Following the individual scoring of the rubric, reviewers collectively discuss the application and make an overall recommendation for whether the institution should receive the EIA designation. Institutions who are recommended for the designation will then be considered by the reviewers for the sustained designation based on whether evidence was provided that the institution has been engaged in meaningful institution-wide assessment practices for at least the last 5 years. In other words, sustained designations are determined holistically after all of the criteria have been rated. Each application is reviewed on the basis of its own merits and is not considered in comparison to other applications received or reviewed. There is neither a minimum nor a maximum number of EIA designations that may be made in a given year. So, here's the timeline for this year. We invite you to also review the information on our current EIA website as to the deadline and when institutions are notified of their results, when we publicly announce the designee, and a couple of opportunities not only to provide institutions with some mentoring, but also when we actually celebrate the designees for that previous year. So now I will turn it over to Tammy and Melanie to talk a little bit about what they are doing at their institutions and how they use the EIA process and some lessons learned. I will also recommend that you look at the past few years. The January, February editions of the assessment update have highlighted many of our previous designees, and they too talk about lessons learned and their EIA experience. And so if you want more information, it's definitely a really good place to start. So Tammy and Melanie, let's get going. Tammy, we'll start with you.
All Right. Well, thank you so much. That was a great overview. I am from McKendree University, and I've been at McKendree for 26 years. And I do think that it is sort of important that if you wish to apply for this, that there is someone at your institution who's been there for a while, who's done, at least been involved in doing some of this work, because I do think it does sort of take somebody who is excited about doing this, and then you need to get a lot of somebody's excited. So I basically just want to walk through relatively quickly just a few tips that I would say McKendree learned on this. The first tip is we applied in 2016, and we were not one of the winners in 2016. We got great feedback back, and I think that that's one of my first lessons is don't feel like you absolutely have to be perfect, because none of us are perfect in this, and we weren't perfect in 2016, and we're not perfect in 2020. But in 2016, we were actually really excited. We'd been doing a lot of good work. So we thought, we're just going to apply. It was when it first came out, I was excited when I heard about it. And we did not get it, but we got really valuable feedback. So I just want to kind of put that out there. I don't think very many people talk about maybe how many times they applied. Maybe McKendree is one of the only places that did apply multiple times, but we applied in 2016. And then we had our HLC accreditation visit in 2018. And I just said, that's what our focus is. So we didn't apply again until 2020. So we applied in 2016. We got some really great feedback. We used that feedback to help us have a really successful 2018 accreditation visit. And then in 2020, we were ready to apply again. So I just want to kind of put that out there that you maybe you maybe won't get it the first time you apply, but I think it's still really valuable. And I'm so glad that we did try to apply in 2016, because I think it really helped our accreditation visit. So the first thing I do think that,
Tammy, I will
yeah,
interrupt you. You are
sure.
not the only one
Okay, that's
at
great.
all.
That's great. I thought maybe McKendree was the only one who had to
No.
apply
No,
multiple
no, no.
times. Thank you. So one thing that I think though, it was so helpful to us though to get the feedback that we got back in 2016. So really important. So after you've decided that you're going to apply, I do think you need a committee. Most of you on your campuses probably already have a pre-existing assessment committee of some sort. We had we have a student learning assessment and teaching effectiveness slate committee. And that slate committee, then they already knew about it because we'd applied back in 2016. And actually some members of the committee were like, when are we going to apply again? And I kept saying, we have to get through our accreditation visit. That's our big focus now. And then I kind of kept saying, we can't apply until we check this thing off. So there were some goals that we had, but really applying in 2016 helped us with our accreditation, and then it helped us again. So I would really say that the process is important. If you see that the due date's in May, I don't think you should try to start talking about it to your committee in April. I think you should start like right now. So for me, I really use this award as something to help our committee move our work forward. Back in 2016, our student affairs people were kind of involved, but sort of, to be honest, sort of on the periphery in 2016. When we got our feedback back in 2016 that said you really need to integrate student affairs, then we've really integrated student affairs. So I think that there's a lot that can happen from applying. Now, we don't want everyone to just apply if you're like, hey, we're not in good shape. But if you're in pretty good shape, I think applying can really be valuable. And then you can bring that feedback back to your committee. So make sure you have a committee. If you don't have a committee, you need a committee, because you really do. I mean, there should be some sort of assessment teaching effectiveness committee. But then I think using that committee can help you kind of guide the work that you need to be doing on that committee, to be quite honest. So the process for us is we started back in 2016. We had the whole committee worked on it. And then the committee even made some goals right away when we saw some things as we were filling out the application. We were like, we should probably work on this. And then 4 years later, we decided to apply again. But that was pretty intentional because of accreditation. So for us, that was our process. Use this award. I really think that this award can be used for inspiration, accountability, and motivation. Inspiration, maybe you have an assessment committee that kind of goes, what should we work on? Well, this this award will tell you very clearly when you start to be pretty honest and reflective things you should work on. And then for me, I think it was very motivating, that I think it actually helped to motivate that people saw that there was this award we could win, and it kind of put external validity. It also was so helpful for me, Tammy, personally, because rather than me saying, hey, there's different levels of assessment that they should all build on themselves, I could say this award tells us that there's different levels. So for me, I really used this award to help me teach people on my campus. And when people would say, why are we doing this? It gave us really good external validity that I could say, these experts are telling us that this is best practice. And last time when we applied in 2016, we didn't get it because we were short on this. So it really helped me move my assessment work forward with faculty and staff. The next one is being very reflective. And I think this is one that when you're writing for accreditation, you're so afraid to be honest. And sometimes you're so afraid to say, and no one is completing this rubric, or this rubric has not proved to be valuable. You're kind of almost embarrassed when things don't work out because you're so worried about accreditation. With this, I really feel like this is your chance where you can kind of be more honest. You can tell your story. You can say, this rubric, we were all excited about this rubric. Then we started to use the rubric and it did not work. So therefore we had to push the pause button and we had to redo the rubric. So I think that the opportunities to be reflective on this are really important. And I think this can kind of dovetail with your work and with accreditation as well. And then that easily goes on to continuous improvement, that here in 2016, we did not get the award. We kept working. We knew that we were in the middle of a lot of things were still kind of going on, and we were able to firm those up, really move student affairs in much more, and they were happy to be involved actually. But it's a continuous improvement. And even now, our report is certainly not perfect. Our assessment initiatives are not perfect. We've thrown COVID in that has really made things extra not perfect, but we are very clear that we are committed to assessment and we have the right people, we have the right committee, the right committees. I think the timing issue for us was really valuable, that we applied in 2016. We had HLC visit in 2018. We got feedback back from HLC, and then we applied again in 2020. And then I just think that this award can be so helpful for you in your work, in your role. If you were brand new in the assessment role, I think pulling this in could be really valuable. If maybe you've been going along and things have sort of, you need a little shot, you need a little shot of energy, this award might do that. So those are my quick tips, my big five, and I'll take questions after Melanie goes.
Well, I will, before Melanie goes, because you talked just about HLC. Jordan asked, would you say that you use any of your HLC assurance arguments to help guide your EIA application?
Yes, actually, we had our EIA, our Excellence in Assessment from 2016, and then we kind of tweaked that work for our HLC, and then when we applied again, we kind of used it. So absolutely, I think there is no rule against that. Our web page has this same information, and then we use the same information for the EIA and the same information for HLC. So I'm a big believer in that. It's not plagiarism when it's all yours. So it's absolutely, you can write up a good definition and use it multiple times.
And Assess UNM asked, what period of time should your narrative/application encompass? Is it reflective of a certain amount of years?
Well, for us, it really is for about a 7-year time frame, because a lot of our assessment cycle is on a 7-year time frame. So only talking about what we did last year would miss a lot. So I think you are kind of writing about maybe the last 5-6 years or something like that. There's not really a time frame, but you would not just write what you did in the last year, would be my opinion. That I think most of us, our assessment initiatives are longer than that.
Agreed. And I think with the sustained excellence, again, they were able to show evidence that they've been doing this for 5 or more years. And so being very clear in your application narrative about how long you've been doing this makes it easier for the reviewers. So thank you, Tammy. Melanie,
Well, good evening.
welcome.
How are you all? Good. So I'm Melanie Wasinski. I'm the director of the Office of University Assessment at FAMU. And FAMU is an HBCU located in Tallahassee, Florida, just so you'll know a little bit about us. And our process is going to be very similar in some ways to Tammy's, but very different in other ways. So I began with the university 2 years ago as the director of assessment. Almost immediately, my assistant director was promoted out of my office and became a director in another area of the university. And so I had a new assistant director. And so one of the things that we had was a very new assessment group leading this process. And that actually helped us in many ways because we came in with a very clear, there weren't any sacred cows, so to speak. So we were able to come in and say, we're all new. We don't have anything that we're tied to emotionally. And so we're going to start from scratch. And so our process was to sit down with the resources that were available to us. The two main ones being, of course, the rubric, and the second one being the NILOA transparency framework. And we had came up with a kind of a three-pronged approach. With that rubric were two prongs. The first one, what we called our low-hanging fruit, the things that we knew we could change pretty quickly without anyone getting too upset with us. And then we had what we called our long-term goals, the things that we wanted to achieve in the next 2 years. So when I started, this was an immediate conversation that I had with my supervisor, vice president, was that we were going to do this. We had that conversation for a year. We talked about it to everyone. While we really weren't doing, we kind of had those long-term goals and some of those short-term goals we were working on, but we really talked about it more than anything for about a year because no one knew about it. And so we really wanted to put it out into the realm, into our university, that this was something we were absolutely ready and willing to do. So we did that. And then we worked on those short-term and long-term. We actually had a 2-year plan to get to where we wanted to be. And then the third piece was looking at that transparency framework. And I will tell you that we did a complete overhaul of our website. So we were kind of in that give you everything, whether it made sense or not kind of role. And we started taking things down that we felt weren't valuable and putting things up. We put on our time frame. We looked at how we started just putting things that were really meaningful to people. We built a resource library where you can go and get information, and we were very strategic about what we put on those pages. So everything we looked at, we said, why are we doing this? Who is it valuable to? Should we continue to do this? Is this valuable to anyone? If it's not, take it down. If it is, put it up. And so we did a complete overhaul. Funny story, right as we submitted our application, our website unexplainably went down. So it was 24 hours of panicked conversation. They're looking at it now, please put it back up. And what came back up was 7 years old. And so we didn't have to redo it. Luckily, they were able to find the right website and put it back up. But it was about 24 hours of panic. So you'll always have something like that there. So our stakeholders, we were very lucky. Our president, when he was our provost, started our office. Our provost was our vice president. Everyone came from our side of the house. So everyone knew kind of what we were doing and how valuable it was. But we had to get a lot of stakeholders on board. So we had to get our institutional level assessment committee, our general education assessment committee. We talked about it at faculty planning meetings. We talked about it, anywhere that Melanie was, she was talking about this excellence in assessment designation and what it would mean for our university and how important it was. And so we talked about it a lot. We brought a lot of stakeholders on. Now, as we went through the rubric, we realized that we were missing external stakeholders. We were missing a lot of student engagement in this. And it had been there, but it somehow through time had just kind of passed away. And so we started bringing people back. We put in a vote to get our institution level assessment committee and bring in additional stakeholders. We brought one in from our community college, one from the other state university that we share the city with, because that's where most of our students go to get their master's degrees. We just started pulling people in. We want a business leader in the area to come, and we haven't quite gotten that person on yet. COVID kind of slowed us down. So those are some things that we worked on. As I talked about goal setting, we set some very clear 2-year goals. These are the things we know we can accomplish. We were very, very strategic about what we could accomplish and what we could get done. And knowing that if we didn't get it the first time, that we would keep trying until we did. But we were lucky enough that we are not lucky enough. We were fortunate enough to have a good writer, and we were able to get there. So our goal setting now is a 5-year plan to 2025 sustained excellence. So we've already put that up to our president. He's already approved it and said on the dotted line, yes, this is a good plan. This is what you will do. So in 5 years, we're going to be sitting hopefully in the chair that Tammy's sitting in right now with that backdrop. And I will definitely have that backdrop. So that's something that we're working toward. Very important to have very clear expectations of yourself. As we got toward COVID, knocked us out, we had ILAC meetings that were canceled. We weren't able to do things. Very, very, we had to be realistic. Can we get this done? If not, then we need to talk about it in our improvement narrative and be open and honest about the fact this is our goal, but we just didn't hit it. And there were a couple that we didn't hit that we know that we're going to go back and we continue to revisit. And those are the things that we're continually working on. We did not particularly choose a time frame. As I said, I'd been there 2 years. My assistant director had been there 1. We didn't have a whole lot of historical knowledge. We had to go back and dig through files to find that information. And because of that, that may have been, a challenge for us, but it was in some ways, like I said, a good challenge. So our biggest challenge and our biggest reward were the same thing, that 3,000 word limit. So I will tell you that at one point it was about 5,000 words, and then we got it down to like 3,125, and we could not figure where to cut the 125 out. We sent it out to a professor on our campus and had them read it. We sent it to our vice president and had them read it. We were trying everything to get it cut down. I think we ended up at like 2,998 words. We were very pleased with that because it took a lot of work. Now, it's been a reward because I sit in a lot of meetings now with specialized accreditors and SAC COC where I can explain what we do, because what it does is it forces you to really choose what's important to you. What does your office really stand for? What are you really doing this for? And so I can very clearly communicate that, not that I couldn't before, but I have a clearer definition now of the things that really make a difference to our office, not the things that we do ancillary that are assessment like, but the things that are truly our core values. And so we're able to talk about those much more clearly now than we could have in the past. So that's been a reward for us in those 3,000 words. It's there for a reason. It's very frustrating. I won't lie to you. It was to us anyway. But we did finally get it down there. So, and then at the time we thought, well, we're leaving things out, but were they the important things? And the answer to that is probably no. And so that's where we are in our assessment.
Thank you
Mm-hmm.
both. I think, as you just said, Melanie, right, trying to make sense of that, like the fact that you didn't have those documented and now you do, you sort of have this knowledge management that can continue on. And I think all of the designees are able to now have at least a story from the year that they were designated, and you can now move forward and ahead. So it's awesome. It's a lot of work, but it's definitely worth it.
Thank you both for letting us in a sneak peek on your processes. So as we wrap up, and as we reflected on the first year of the designation, both the reviewers and sponsors noted several points where applicants appeared to struggle in compiling their application narrative. Some of these areas were due to lack of clarity in the application guidelines, which we've attempted to rectify in these guidelines. Some areas, similarly, were due to misalignment between the evidence we asked institutions to provide and the evidence our reviewers said would be most useful to evaluate a campus. We've likewise made adjustments to these guidelines to address those areas, as well as clarify our scoring rubric to really get at the essential elements of each component. This has been a process of improvement for us in taking in feedback from institutions, and we have in many ways co-constructed the rubric with you, our institutions. Reviewers also noted that many institutions seem to struggle with presenting a cohesive and concise narrative regarding their institutional level assessment process. The difficulty came from making an active shift away from simply listing processes and activities to focusing on explaining why the processes in place at their institution matter for their specific setting or students. Providing appropriate background context for assessment practices is important for reviewers and others to understand why the institution engages with and approaches assessment in the manner it does. Many institutions defaulted to providing lists of various disconnected activities without connecting or aligning the activities into a cohesive narrative and describing or explaining the relationships between the various parts. Applicants are strongly encouraged to approach the narrative as a representation of the collective whole of assessment activities, one that is placed within a specific institutional context, and to provide that context explicitly within their narrative when necessary. It's not enough to say that an institution is engaged in a particular assessment practice without articulating why that practice is important within that context. A resource to help with this is the Evidence-Based Storytelling Kit on the NILOA website. We hope that you will check it out if you haven't already. Definitely a really good toolkit in assisting you in telling your evidence-based institutional assessment story. So we hope that within this presentation, and hopefully with some of the other conversations that you've had with others around the Excellence in Assessment designation, that you realize that this brings together the current state of the art of learning outcomes assessment with shifts in the field of transparency of student learning. Its function is to provide examples to the field, but also to help institutions tell a coherent story of their assessment processes and practices. I want to also, before we end, share our current EIA designees so that you can see the list of those. The following slides highlight these institutions that are working to tell their institutional assessment story using a nuanced, tailored framework for communicating outcomes, improvements, in a comprehensive, student-focused, culturally responsive way, as so eloquently described by Dr. Kinsey. These are 2020 designees, Sustained Excellence designees, our 2020 Excellence in Assessment designees. Quite a big class this past year for sure. 2019. 2018. And I'll add here, you can find snippets of each of these institutions on our website. So please check out those brief blurbs on each institution, 2017 and 2016, our very first class. So thank you for joining us. We hope that we'll take back some good nuggets to your institution if you're thinking about applying. If you have any questions about the application or review process, do not hesitate to contact me. Thank you for joining us today.